You are not tired because you did too much. You are tired because you have been someone you're not. Carl Jung once warned that the greatest exhaustion does not come from work, but from living against your own nature. There is a kind of fatigue that sleep does not touch. You wake up heavy. You avoid conversations. You stare at your responsibilities and feel nothing but resistance. And what scares you most is not the tiredness. It's the thought that maybe you're becoming weak. But what if this exhaustion is not weakness? What if it's the moment your psyche refuses to keep pretending? If you feel constantly exhausted lately, this might be the most important message you'll hear. Carl Jung believed that when you are deeply tired for no clear reason, it is often because your soul is withdrawing from a life that no longer fits. You are not just physically drained. You are psychologically overextended. And the part of you that has been performing for years is finally collapsing. The psychologist observed something that most people never question. When you suppress parts of yourself long enough, the energy required to keep them down becomes greater than the energy required to face them. And that is when exhaustion begins. Not when life becomes objectively harder, but when the inner split becomes too wide. Every time you swallow anger instead of expressing it, it costs energy. Every time you say yes when you mean no, it costs energy. Every time you stay calm while something inside you wants to scream, it costs energy. Every time you smile to avoid tension, it costs energy. Individually, these moments seem small, but over years, they accumulate. And suppression is not passive. It is active labor. You have to monitor yourself, edit yourself, restrain yourself, soften your tone, reduce your needs, shrink your intensity. That constant self-monitoring becomes a background process running in your nervous system all day. You rarely notice it consciously, but your body does. Your muscles tighten. Your breathing becomes shallow. Your sleep becomes lighter. Your digestion changes. The system is in quiet overdrive. The depth psychologists describe the shadow as the parts of us that were rejected in order to be accepted. Often that includes anger, ambition, sensitivity, selfishness, neediness, assertiveness, even joy. If you learned early that being easy kept you loved, you likely pushed away anything that created friction. But friction is part of aliveness. And when you remove friction from your personality, you remove vitality. You become functional, but not energized. You become responsible, but not inspired. You become reliable, but not internally aligned. Exhaustion is often the first signal that vitality has been traded for approval. And approval is expensive, especially for empathic, high-functioning people. Because you are good at reading the room. You anticipate needs before they are spoken. You adjust tone before conflict escalates. You absorb emotional shifts like a sponge. And because you can handle it, you keep doing it. Until one day, you can't. Not because you suddenly became incapable, but because your system has reached its threshold. He wrote that neurosis is often the result of living too far from one's own center. And distance from your center requires constant compensation. You compensate by overworking, by overthinking, by over-explaining, by overgiving. Compensation feels productive, but it drains the core. This is why you may feel paradoxical lately. You are not doing less, but you feel like you have less energy. You are not necessarily facing a crisis, but you feel internally unstable. You are not physically ill, but your body feels heavy because your exhaustion is not about output. It is about misalignment. When your outer behavior no longer reflects your inner truth, the psyche begins withdrawing cooperation. Motivation drops. Focus weakens. Drive fades. Not to sabotage you, but to stop you from continuing on autopilot. The collapse of motivation is often the beginning of consciousness. When you can no longer push through the way you used to, you are forced to ask why you were pushing in the first place. That question is destabilizing because it may reveal that much of your energy was fueled by fear. Fear of being irrelevant. Fear of being rejected. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of disappointing others. Fear of not being enough. Fear is a powerful engine. It keeps you performing long after alignment has disappeared. But fear-driven performance is exhausting. And once the psyche recognizes that fear is no longer sustainable as fuel, it pulls the plug. That moment feels like collapse, but it is actually refusal. Refusal to continue betraying yourself for stability. This is why exhaustion often appears during transformation. You are not only shedding habits, you are shedding identities. And identities are energetic structures. When one dissolves, the system needs time to reorganize. That reorganization feels slow, quiet, unproductive, but internally, something is recalibrating. If you are deeply tired lately, it may not mean you need more discipline. It may mean you need more honesty. Honesty about what drains you. Honesty about what no longer fits. Honesty about where you have been overextending. Honesty about who you have been trying to be. The psychologist believed that individuation requires confrontation with the shadow. But confrontation is not loud. Sometimes it is simply noticing where resentment hides, where bitterness appears, where numbness replaces enthusiasm. Resentment is a boundary that was never spoken. Numbness is a desire that was never allowed. And chronic exhaustion is often a self that was never fully lived. You are not tired because you are weak. You are tired because you are splitting your energy between who you are and who you think you must be. And splitting is unsustainable. Eventually, the body sides with the truth. And when it does, it slows you down, not as punishment, as protection. What makes this kind of exhaustion so unsettling is not only the physical heaviness, but the timing of it, because it often arrives in a phase of life where, on paper, everything should finally feel stable, structured, and under control. And yet internally, something feels more fragile, more uncertain, and more emotionally intense than it did years before. Many people notice that this deeper fatigue does not appear in their early 20s, when adrenaline, ambition, and external validation still provide enough momentum to override inner misalignment, but rather later, when the strategies that once worked begin to lose their power and the cost of maintaining them becomes impossible to ignore. In earlier stages of life, adaptation is often rewarded because being flexible, agreeable, productive, and emotionally available tends to create opportunities, relationships, and approval, and those rewards temporarily mask the fact that something essential may have been sidelined in the process. But adaptation, when it becomes identity, slowly erodes vitality. The psychologist described individuation as a movement toward the center of one's own psyche, a return to what is internally true rather than externally reinforced. And this movement often begins not with inspiration, but with depletion, because depletion forces awareness where comfort never would. If you have built much of your life around being competent, responsible, emotionally mature, or endlessly understanding, there may come a moment when your system no longer cooperates with that performance, not because those qualities are false, but because they have been exaggerated at the expense of other parts of you that were never given equal space. Sensitive people are particularly prone to this delayed collapse because their capacity to endure, to empathize, and to anticipate emotional dynamics allows them to function for years in environments that are subtly draining, while convincing themselves that they are simply strong enough to handle it. But endurance is not the same as alignment. You may have endured relationships where you were the stabilizer, workplaces where you were the emotional buffer, friendships where you were the listener more than the speaker, and family dynamics where you absorbed tension to prevent escalation. And while none of these roles are inherently unhealthy, they become unsustainable when they are one-sided and prolonged. The crash does not happen because you suddenly lost resilience. It happens because resilience without reciprocity slowly turns into depletion. What often triggers this phase is not a dramatic external event, but a subtle internal shift. A quiet realization that you are no longer willing to trade authenticity for approval, or peace for performance, or belonging for self-suppression, even if you have not yet consciously articulated that decision. And when that inner decision begins forming, even unconsciously, your energy starts withdrawing from the structures that no longer feel aligned. This withdrawal can feel like apathy, like brain fog, like reduced motivation, like social fatigue, like an unexplained need for solitude. And because these symptoms resemble weakness in a culture that glorifies productivity, you may interpret them as personal failure rather than psychological recalibration. But recalibration always feels disorienting before it feels liberating. When an old identity dissolves, even partially, the psyche enters a transitional state in which the familiar is gone, but the new has not yet solidified. And this in-between space is profoundly energy-consuming because uncertainty requires constant internal processing. You are reevaluating values you once took for granted. You are questioning ambitions that once defined you. You are reassessing relationships that once felt obvious. And that kind of internal restructuring demands enormous psychological energy, even if you are not consciously aware of how much is happening beneath the surface. He wrote that symptoms often appear when the conscious life no longer reflects the needs of the unconscious, and exhaustion can be one of the most subtle yet powerful symptoms of that misalignment, because it removes your ability to keep distracting yourself through activity. When you are exhausted, you cannot overfunction as easily. You cannot say yes as quickly. You cannot sustain the same level of output. And in that forced slowing down, truths begin surfacing. You may begin noticing resentment, where you once felt obligation. You may begin sensing emptiness where you once felt ambition. You may begin recognizing that certain environments leave you depleted in ways that rest alone does not repair. This phase is especially confronting for people whose self-worth has been closely tied to usefulness, because when usefulness declines, identity feels threatened, and that threat can create anxiety layered on top of the fatigue. You may fear becoming irrelevant, disappointing others, or losing the version of yourself that once felt competent and admired. And that fear can intensify the exhaustion, because now you are not only tired, you are also resisting the transformation that the tiredness is trying to initiate. But the psyche does not collapse randomly. It withdraws energy strategically. When something in your life no longer supports your psychological growth, your system gradually reduces the vitality available for sustaining it. And while this feels destabilizing, it is often protective. What you interpret as losing energy may actually be energy being redirected toward integration, toward confronting truths you postponed, toward reclaiming parts of yourself that were minimized, toward redefining what strength actually means, because real strength is not endless endurance. It is sustainable alignment. And alignment requires change. Change requires letting go. Letting go requires grieving. And grieving, even when subtle, is exhausting. If you feel unusually drained in this season of your life, it may not be because you are failing, but because you are no longer willing to unconsciously repeat patterns that once kept you safe, but are now restricting your growth. And that refusal, though quiet, is powerful. It signals that something within you is reorganizing at a level deeper than motivation, deeper than discipline, deeper than productivity. It signals that you are in transition, and transition, before it feels like expansion, almost always feels like depletion. What most people do in this phase is panic, because when your energy drops and your motivation weakens, the instinct is to force yourself back into productivity, to discipline yourself harder, to optimize your routines, to push through the fatigue as if it were a flaw that needs correction. But forcing movement during psychological reorganization often deepens the split instead of healing it. When exhaustion is rooted in misalignment rather than workload, more discipline does not restore vitality. Honesty does. Energy begins returning not when you do more, but when you stop doing what drains you at the level of identity. This is subtle because the drains are rarely dramatic. They are patterns, micro-compromises, small self-abandonments repeated daily. It might be the way you automatically reassure others before expressing your own discomfort. It might be the way you minimize your needs so that no one feels burdened. It might be the way you overprepare, overthink, or overperform to avoid criticism. Each of these behaviors seems harmless in isolation, but together they create a constant outward flow of energy with very little return. The psychologist understood that vitality is directly connected to integration, and integration requires that the parts of you that were silenced are gradually allowed expression, not explosively, but consciously. If anger has been suppressed, energy returns when boundaries are spoken. If sadness has been denied, energy returns when grief is acknowledged instead of bypassed. If ambition was shaped around approval rather than authenticity, energy returns when direction is reevaluated without external pressure. This is not a dramatic reinvention. It is a recalibration, and recalibration is slow. You may notice that instead of feeling instantly energized, you feel quieter, more grounded, less reactive, and that quietness can initially be mistaken for dullness because we often associate aliveness with intensity. But intensity is not the same as vitality. Intensity is often fueled by fear, urgency, or external validation. Vitality is steadier. It feels less dramatic, but more sustainable. When you begin telling the truth in small ways, even if your voice shakes, something subtle shifts internally. When you say no without over-explaining. When you allow silence instead of filling it. When you stop volunteering to carry emotional weight that is not yours. When you resist the impulse to fix everything. These moments may feel uncomfortable at first because the identity that kept you safe resists change. But with each aligned action, a small amount of energy is reclaimed. Exhaustion lessens not because life becomes easier, but because you stop leaking yourself into roles that no longer fit. There is also a biological component to this process that often goes unacknowledged, because chronic self-suppression keeps the nervous system in a subtle state of vigilance, and vigilance is metabolically expensive. When you begin reducing self-monitoring and hyper-responsibility, your system gradually exits that constant alertness, and as it does, you may initially feel even more tired because your body is finally allowing itself to rest at a depth it has postponed for years. That deeper rest is not regression. It is repair. Many people misinterpret this phase as depression, and while clinical depression is real and serious, there is also a transitional fatigue that accompanies psychological integration, a fatigue that signals not hopelessness, but restructuring. He suggested that symptoms are often attempts of the psyche to restore balance, and exhaustion can be one of the gentlest yet most powerful correctives, because it removes your ability to continue ignoring yourself. You cannot outrun exhaustion forever. You cannot outthink it. You cannot optimize your way out of it. Eventually, you must listen. Listening does not mean quitting your life overnight or burning down every structure around you. It means observing honestly where your energy contracts and where it expands. Notice the conversations after which you feel depleted rather than connected. Notice the environments that require constant self-editing. Notice the ambitions that feel heavy instead of meaningful. Your body already knows. Exhaustion is often the first language it uses. As alignment increases, even slightly, you may notice small but significant shifts. You recover faster after social interaction. You feel clearer after expressing a boundary. You experience moments of calm without guilt. You begin sensing direction emerging quietly rather than chasing it anxiously. Energy does not return as a sudden surge. It returns as coherence. As your inner world and outer behavior begin matching more closely, the friction decreases. And where friction decreases, vitality slowly grows. This process cannot be rushed. If you attempt to rebuild your old level of productivity before integration stabilizes, you will likely recreate the same exhaustion under a new label. Sustainable energy is built on self-trust. Self-trust grows when you consistently act in alignment with what you know to be true, even when that truth disappoints others or disrupts familiar dynamics. The irony is that the version of you who once powered through everything may have appeared strong, but the version of you who now pauses, reflects, and refuses to overextend is far more psychologically mature. Exhaustion stripped away the illusion of infinite capacity. What remains is honesty, and honesty is the foundation of wholeness. If you are in this phase right now, if you feel drained in ways that are difficult to explain, if your old strategies no longer energize you and your usual discipline feels ineffective, consider the possibility that nothing is wrong with you. Consider that your psyche is recalibrating. Consider that this fatigue is not a verdict, but a threshold. You are not collapsing, you are shedding. And shedding is not glamorous, but it is necessary for growth. Energy will return, not because you forced it, but because you stopped fighting the transformation that demanded it. And when it does return, it will feel different, quieter, cleaner, less frantic, more yours. If this resonated with you, and you want to explore depth psychology and inner transformation further, subscribe to Soul of the Mind. You are not lazy. You are not broken. You are realigning.